Okay, after many attempts of doing this, many takes in fact, uh, let me just put it out there and talk about a number of philosophers or sociologists that we need to cover for your Theory 2 class. No? It is my way of making up for our lost time given the pandemic, although it's an abridged and a very shortened one. I will try to present to you a kind of survey of the existing perspectives within modern sociological theory after Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. By using the essay that I wrote for another class, for the Understanding the Self class, but I think it's a good vehicle to make sense of the different perspectives through the prism of freedom and constraint. No, one of the interesting dilemmas that was presented to me as an undergrad before was the existential question of whether human beings are indeed free or not. No, uh, I did not find the answer in uh, the course that I got into, which was BA Psychology. When I took up Social Science 2, I had a teacher from the Department of Sociology, and her perspectives, what she taught us, uh, introduced to me the discipline that could possibly provide answers, no, to the burning questions I had then as an undergrad, uh, figuring out his place in the world and answering the big questions of life. In any case, no, um, this exercise is meant to infuse you with that same curiosity. Uh, the idea here is for you to um, have a kind of introduction to different perspectives within modern sociological theory by way of a philosophical question. Are human beings truly free? Or are we uh, just pawns, cogs in a machine where a larger external power determines our behavior and choices? No? So let me now go to the particular essay, no, entitled "Between Freedom and Constraint." No? This is actually inspired by a book that I happened to come across in my first years of teaching the sociology of everyday life. Karp and Yoels also did the same thing, although they used that kind of philosophical problematic to answer the question of or to introduce the sociologies of everyday life. We'll touch upon that a little bit when you talk about George Herbert Mead and Berger and Luckmann. But we'll go beyond that and talk about dramaturgical sociology of Goffman. Then we'll talk about Michel Foucault. At the same time, also in the second part, discuss Durkheim and Marx, no, to address the question of freedom and constraint. So let me begin. No, um, sociology has always been accused of being partial to uh, determining the forces that shape individual behavior instead of looking at behavior from the perspective of the individual. No? We always looked at the human being within a context, and that what makes us sociology, and that's the kind of unique perspective that we offer. But I'm going to say early on that that might not be exactly accurate, although to a certain degree it is really possible to imagine sociology as having that kind of bias towards society as opposed to the individual. No, but that bias will only make sense if you separate the two. From the perspective of sociology, the individual and society cannot actually be seen as independent, uh, active forces, but they are engaged with each other in a dialectical relationship. Okay, so my insistence, no, and my preliminary assumption, which I would try to go back to later on when I talk about the conclusion, is that the self is uh, inextricably linked to society. Human beings practice freedom, but this freedom can only make sense within the rules and norms and possibilities that society allows. Okay, and I'll have a number of uh, reasons for saying that. Okay, um, let me begin by talking about the ideas of George Herbert Mead and a set or a pair of phenomenological sociologists in the persons of uh, Thomas Berger and Peter Luckmann. Or I may have had that the other way around. That's Peter Berger and Thomas Luckmann. Okay. Uh, George Herbert Mead was somebody who founded the perspective of social psychology within sociology. I know that social psychology is also a discipline, a sub-discipline of psychology as a perspective. But George Herbert Mead is someone who is ours in that sense because he looked at the self not as an individual and explaining individual from the perspective of human behavior, but he looked at the self in the context of social interaction. You know, he imagined the self as a product of an individual's interaction with others. You know, and this self is a product of a process called socialization. Okay. What George Herbert Mead is trying to arrive at is that we cannot arrive at complete functional selves if we were bereft of the process of socialization. One way by which sociologists tried to make sense of this was to use as an example the case of feral children. These are children who were not raised in traditional households where you have nurturing parents and siblings who interacted with that child. An example of this would probably be Tarzan, who was raised in the wild, and Tarzan would uh, be bereft of the kind of language and physical interaction between mother and the baby, and the father and the baby, and the siblings and the baby, because Tarzan would have been raised by chimpanzees and wolves, no, and their sophistication when it came to uh, language was less compared to human beings, no. Although there had been no uh, although I'm not really sure because there are a lot of movies about this already, and Tarzan, while I was growing up, was very popular. But the closest thing to a feral child that they were able to study uh, scientifically was the case of abandoned children. No? For some reason or another, they found a child, I think, 4 to 7 years old, who was fed and clothed but kept in the attic because maybe that child, I think I'm remembering it already, was born out of wedlock, unwanted, uh, was the child of a very young mother, and so to save themselves from embarrassment, they uh, kept the child in the attic, bereft of any kind of social interaction, and they realized that uh, children who were separated from uh, their uh, nuclear family in this manner, bereft of the kind of interaction that normal families would have, uh, was stunted not just intellectually but also physically and socially. Even though they were rehabilitated later on when they were rescued from their definitely abusive condition, they still did not had that facility to recover and rejoin normal society as it were, no? Uh, because there's something special that takes place in the process of socialization. And this is where Peter Berger and Thomas Luckmann came in, reinterpreting the ideas of George Herbert Mead when it came to how the self achieved a kind of completeness, no? From fragmented selves, how do we become complete functional human beings capable of participating in society. Where does this whole idea of, in Bisaya we call this as naanay buot, no? Where does this whole idea of being a mature functional adult come from, and what are the processes that must be uh, hurdled in order to call oneself a complete human being, no? Peter Berger and Thomas Luckmann used the ideas of George Herbert Mead by uh, looking at a two-pronged process. First, Berger and Luckmann argued that we achieve fragmented self when we are capable of looking at ourselves from the perspectives of our significant others. Who are these significant others? No, parents. Okay, the process of socialization is, of course, nothing but when we're capable of putting ourselves in the shoes of the other. That's also a very Weberian way of looking at it, no? Because, of course, there's a long line of uh, theory that came from Max Weber to George Herbert Mead, then to Peter Berger and Luckmann. All of them were part of the sociologies of everyday life that dealt with the problems of everyday reality and self in relation to society. No, a different kind of emphasis as compared to if you were to look at structural sociology, classical sociology, and the problems that Marx and Durkheim dealt with. But we'll go back to them in a little while. Okay, so what happened here? No, Berger and Luckmann said that there's an important element that makes us well, makes us human beings, not yet complete, but somehow fragmented, but getting there. And that is language. No? What does language do? What language does essentially is allow us to look at ourselves from the perspective of another person, another vista. And from that point of view, we will be able to control our behavior relating to the behavior of our interpretation of behavior of the other person. It's actually a very magnificent and powerful picture of how human beings come to be human beings. No, I mean, on the other hand, we are biological beings who need to eat, who need to be clean, to deal with viruses, and all the other requirements to keep flesh and bone together. But there's also another process that makes us uh, completely social beings, no? And that process has something to do with how we are capable of imagining ourselves from the perspective of other people. In other words, what Berger and Luckman is trying to drive at is the importance of language as a means to imagine oneself. No? And that can only take place within a social unit such as the family. Because what do parents do when children are brought up supposedly in the process of socialization? They talk to them, they relate to them, they teach them words. What are the first words that a child utters? No, mama, papa. No, um, he knows that when he utters those words, it refers to that other being which is separate from him or her. But that other being can be asked to deal with whatever is bothering that child, whether it's hunger, whether it's attention, whether it's all these other requirements, no, that can only be expressed if you have a recognition that you're a separate entity from that other being, and that other being is of course your significant others, your immediate family members, no. um, it is a powerful picture of the process of socialization. Apart from being biological beings, which our significant others also attend to, our social beingness is also being nurtured by our significant others, parallel to that. And without that help Without that assistance, you will not be able to develop fully, like the feral child, no? Because you will only become a person capable of learning how it is to be a human being if you are able to imagine yourself as a separate entity from those of others. That's what a significant other person. Uh, what that's the role of significant others to the growth of a child. What happens after that? No, you learn that your parents have certain rules about how to go about living. No, I mean I don't have my own kid, but I have a smart Labrador puppy who's about 6 months old by now, seven. But as early as when he was 4 months, no, through a process of socialization, and I will not tell you how, because the animal abuse might come over and take me away. He has learned uh, to shit and pee at his own enclosure, which I've made for him. No, of course, it was a long process. I think it took about a month or so teaching him that it is wrong to pee anywhere. It is wrong to shit anywhere inside the house. Imagine, you waking up every morning and having to scoop up warm shit. No, you would really be inspired to train your dog to do something about it. I've been to three Labradors already, and I've managed to do that. I have a senior dog who's 10 years old. I have the pup's mother who's just with me for about 2 years, and I've all successfully trained them. So I had no doubt that it was possible. But I think that dog needed to realize that there are certain expectations between me and him. No, I think it helped that none of the older dogs did it inside the house. No, but uh, he's kind of special. I taught the other dogs to do it outside when I take them out. But this dog, because I don't have the patience anymore to do that, uh, has his own enclosure outside of the house where he can go in and out anytime to do his business. No, that's the same thing with children. No, um, and I'm going to use here the example of the soup spilling kid as a way to give an idea of what I mean. No, imagine this little toddler. Okay, uh, trying to separate herself from his immediate family, her immediate family, trying to figure out where's the boundary between who she is and uh, who her parents and her siblings are. Meant that philosophically, but it's actually very simple. As an example, no? This kid is trying to uh, figure out the rules of how it is to grow up in a particular household. One time, it was her sister that was asked to guard her, babysit her, and as a meal, she was offered a mami pancit soup, no, with hot water, and you stir it, and it becomes like the child is just trying to figure out her limbs and anything that she is capable of holding on to. What she does is to throw it away, whether it be a ball or whatever toy. Um, this time around, she did that to a bowl. So when the bowl was offered in front of her, what she did was to, uh, throw the ball away and spill the soup. Of course, the elder sister didn't like it because what a waste, and she would end up cleaning the mess. So she gave the little girl a very stern look and, you know, just a little bit of anger smacked the little baby's hand. And the kid realizes that, oh, one before my sister, I must not spill soup. Now they went out and had soup again, together this time with the mother and the rest of the family in Chowking. She was offered soup, and probably she forgot that her sister doesn't like it, but since it was a different setting, and uh, the conditions were not the same as the first time she spilled soup. She did the same thing, and she noticed that the same look before she was pinched by her sister was also seen in the face of her mother, her father, her other siblings, and even the waiter. You know, the waiter who went to her and who seemed as if the stranger went to her and who seemed as if ready to pinch her as well. You know, and the kid arrives at a very important existential realization at this point. And what is that realization? You know, the kid realizes that one does not spill soup. Okay, that is a momentous moment in the process of socialization. Okay, from the perspective of Berger and Luckmann, it is the clue that that fragmented individual was just capable of imagining herself from the perspective of her significant others is now capable of imagining herself from the perspective of a generalized other. So I am juxtaposing, no, two ideas here, no, from the fragmented self to the complete self, because the interaction took place from the significant other to the generalized other. And what is that bone? What is that anchor of the interaction? The realization of the baby that one does not spill soup. What does one does not spill soup mean? No? For Berger and Luckmann, that was a momentous event in the socialization process, because the statement one does not spill soup actually means that the child is now looking at herself from the perspective of this generalized other. Let's look at the statement. One does not spill soup. Who does one refer to? One and all. No? So it's a rule that not apply to, let's say, if the name of the child was Maria. It does not just apply to Maria, but applies to all Marias, even Jonathans, even Carmelites, or whatever your name is. No, you are not allowed to spill soup. One does not spill soup. Who is this one? Of course, it's easy to say that ate does not want me to spill soup. You know your ate. Mama does not want me to spill soup. The waitress does not want me to spill soup. But when you say one does not spill soup, it means that everyone, who is this everyone that tells you it's wrong to spill soup? Oh, that is where, an important lesson in sociology comes down from the heavens and, reveals itself to us. Who tells us that it is wrong to spill soup? Who else but society? It's a rule of society that one does not spill soup. Who therefore is the generalized other but society at large with its mores, no? And how do you become a complete functioning human being? If you're capable of understanding that one does not spill soup, one does not throw garbage anywhere, one does not defecate or pee, and you have a long list of a litany of lists that tells you what you can and cannot do in order to be awarded the distinction that you are a person na naanay buot, a person with maturity, a person is capable of handling his or herself in the jungles of everyday life society. No, you are only allowed to go out once you have that kind of understanding. Kasi naa nakaibuot. Na nakaibuot means that society is already inside your brain, and you're capable of, in other words, modifying your actions to submit to the rules that society demands from all of us. So the generalized others is indicated by the term one does not spill soup. It is a non-specific mass noun commanding all of us to spill soup. No? Who else is telling us one does not spill soup but the booming voice of society? And let me read through the essay, no, something at a time. Very emphatic in declaring, no, there are telling lessons here on the relationship of the self and society in relation to the question of whether we are actually free or not. From childhood to maturity, society, empowers us to function as biological and socially acceptable human beings through the guidance and nurturance of our families. No, that's of course made possible through the facility of language. We learn how to speak, achieve unique identities, and basically learn the skills that will allow us to survive both biologically and socially. But all these come with a caveat, but hidden price. No? We only become bona fide members of society with socially accepted selves if we are already, you know, individuals capable of knowing the rules and norms of society. And this just goes beyond the knowledge that one does not spill. So therefore, we are given the skills and the consciousness, the desire, on the one hand, to understand uh, that one does not spill soup, but only through such realization. Language has allowed us to do it. No, language has allowed us to understand the rules and norms. But understanding the rules and norms also, in a way, opens up a new universe altogether. No, knowing that the rules make us human beings. No, you can see it as something positive. We are able to relate to one another, function in society. All those uh, functional positivist assumptions that we've had from particular perspective. But it also opens up the whole alluring prospect of freedom. We know that we are not free. Then is it only possible to understand that we can be free after all, after this? Okay. So that's the first part of our lesson. Berger and Luckmann, George Herbert Mead, the fragmented self as opposed to the complete self, vis-a-vis the significant others as opposed to the generalized other. We only become complete human beings when we are able to inculcate society's norms and rules inside our hearts and minds. Okay? But only with the facility of language that allows us to follow the same rules will also allow us the vista or imagination to imagine our freedom. It's a very sexy paradox, no? I find it a very interesting conclusion at the end of Berger and Luckmann's uh, ruminations on how we become human beings. It 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 can be very suffocating realizing that you only become a functioning member of society because you're able to follow the rules that society has taught us in the process of socialization. But the only way by which we will be able to arrive at this realization, this sad realization, is if we have that facility for language. That same facility for language will allow us the possibility beyond the generalized other. Only with the possibility offered by this language will it be possible to imagine freedom. So, constraint and freedom are actually two sides of the same coin, if I may put it that way. You can only understand constraint because you're capable of imagining another world beyond constraint. And of course, that other world, that antonym, the opposite idea is freedom. Wow. You see? Uh, Sociology is sexy that way. Sociology is uh, a very uh, sexy, attractive discourse. If you look at how sociology can play into both social science and philosophy, bridging the two worlds together, and just having your mind blown about all these possibilities. That's also the attraction of theory. if I failed to impress it upon you in the early meetings we've had last semester. No? Theory would be able to bring us to new ways of looking at things. No? That's what Berger and Luckmann did. No? Uh, by talking about constraint, they were inevitably also talking about freedom. Okay, okay, but let's talk about this a lot further. No, although I did start with Berger and Luckmann, let us go back to classical theory. What did the founding fathers say about self society after all? You know, um, it can be encapsulated in a very basic idea, no, uh, pushed by both Durkheim and Marx. Let's start with Marx. No, within sociology, following the perspectives of our classical founding fathers, the self, the idea of the autonomous individual, it's an agent, self-determining, is a modern fiction more than anything else. Okay, the self is a modern fiction. Why did they say this? No, they studied how societies evolve across time and how they imagined each other living within these societies. And Marx had a very uh, systematic way of looking at how individuals or people within different economic stages live their lives within society. He, one of his basic ideas is that consciousness is a product of our material life. No, if you still remember your theory one, uh, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but it is their being, how they relate to each other as material entities living in an economy, a particular kind of economy. It is what is determinant of the kind of desires, imaginations, philosophical vistas, religious beliefs, uh, sexual desires. All of it is a product of man's life within economy. Okay, and Marx believed that in societies that looked at labor as a collective process, all labor is collective, by the way, no, but there are interesting differences in the way societies evolve and how they produce their material needs for existence. No? For instance, in feudal times, no, people live their lives as members of their families as an economic unit. And that's why the tendency was for them to have more children, because more children meant more hands on the farm. No? When you marry into a separate family, it was not more about uh, the romance or the desire, the individual desire for another human being, but more about practical issues such as whether uh, the wife can sire more children or something to that effect. No? You married for less romantic reasons, but you married because she has childbearing hips, and so on and so forth. No? But all of that shifted or changed when society progressed from feudalism to uh, capitalism or the Industrial Revolution. People did not work anymore as collective family units, but people worked as individuals who are capable of selling their labor power to the capitalists as an individual, not as a member of their family. You know? From this basic shift, Marx argued that that's how we become to be engrossed with this whole illusion of freedom, of choice. Your only choice under capitalism for Marx is to whom will you sell your labor power to? No? And it's a question of the highest bidder in terms of low increments or cents for Marx. But we are all fooled by the illusion that we are free under capitalism by the performance of selling one's labor power to the capitalist when in fact you had no choice. In fact, if you were a member of a peasant family, you actually had more choice. No, you had more freedom because you could exist even without the landlord breathing, under your neck, because the landlord only appear during harvest season and get his 60% share. But you can set aside 40%, no, or less, in order to survive for the next few months or so. No, so your survival or your existence did not depend upon, no, the on a day-to-day basis, no, the benevolence of your landlord. Of course, at the end of the harvest cycle, no, it's still a landlord would get the lion's share because he has private property and you don't. No? But from this basic difference, unlike in the industrial revolution and capitalism, you are now free to sell your labor power to the highest capitalist bourgeois factory owner, and you don't have land anymore because the land that you used to plant your potatoes or your rice on has now been converted to grazing area for sheep, and they need the wool for the first industries of capitalism, which is clothes, no? And they need the raw material for that. Now you are thrown out into the urban centers, the growing urban centers, and all you must do is sell your labor power to the factory. So you should watch Les Miserables to make sense of this, to understand of this. No, Eponine, the one that was fired from the job in the factory and became a prostitute, she's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. No? But all this pain and ache about how capitalism takes away our freedom is also at the same time empowered by the very changes that capitalism made possible. No? And now we're back to that paradox that we are talking about again a while ago when we were discussing Berger and Luckmann. Diba? When we were discussing Berger and Luckmann, the paradox then was it is through language that we're capable of imagining ourselves as subjects of the interpolation of society. But it's also through that facility that we're capable of imagining something beyond that. And it's the same thing about Marx. No, capitalism allowed us the freedom to imagine something beyond the freedom, the fake freedom, the illusory freedom that capitalism offered. Because in the end, what was Marx's project? To convince us that all of this is a sham. You're imagining freedom, but what you're offering is just the freedom to sell your labor power to the next highest capitalist bidder. But you'll never have the freedom to become a poet, to become a dancer, to become a human being with talents. All that capitalism does is to exchange all these possibilities for the profit of the factory owner, the one who owns your labor power. So the self is a modern fiction for Marx under these circumstances. No, we're a product of capitalism. No, Foucault would have the same idea. No, I mean, we'll talk about Foucault later. No, but even other modern sociologists. No, you have Ferdinand Tönnies talk about the Gesellschaft and the Gemeinschaft. No, the Gesellschaft pertains to the urban societies, where people are more autonomous individualists, and the Gemeinschaft pertains to the more rural societies where people are collective in terms of orientation. It's not that different from Durkheim's organic solidarities pertaining to the societies of modern societies, capitalist societies, no, as opposed to the idea of organic, no, as opposed to the ideas of Durkheim. No? Okay, I just got lost there. Organic, more, as opposed to more traditional societies. Mechanical, that's it. No? That's a juxtaposition. Durkheim believed that urban societies are more organic. You have their more sophisticated division of labor, whereas rural societies pertain to um, more mechanical solidarities where there's little individuation. So that's also been a problematic within sociology, how to imagine how people related to each other across different social types. But Durkheim actually made a case for the same point that Marx made. Remember that Marx believed that the self is a modern fiction. Uh, Durkheim made the same case for uh, a different, but used a different approach to make the same point. In his work on suicide, he was able to determine that people kill themselves because of the variation in the degrees of solidarity within a particular society. That's a masterstroke within sociology, if you come to think about it. Another kind of genius, a seminal idea that would tell you how brilliant these guys were, in in using and creating a vocabulary. Okay, what kind of idea was behind this work of suicide? The idea here is actually very simple. Think about the most personal thing that a person can do. Uh, you would imagine that killing oneself could be the most like suicide. No, what the act of suicide actually means, it's the act of killing oneself, right? But if you come to think about it, no, you kill oneself because you think that you'd like to have control over your life. It's the singular most psychological act that you can think of. But what Durkheim did, was actually to talk about something, as psychological as suicide sociologically. If society is too strong, no, people tend to kill themselves because they don't see any differentiation from their societies and themselves. Okay, that's what you call as egoistic and altruistic suicide. You know, uh, if you feel like uh, there's well, if you altruistic and fatalistic suicide, the examples of these uh, suicides are caused by too strong bonds within society. Okay, uh, if society demands that you kill yourself for the honor of your society, like harakiri, or that you need a higher harvest to, and you need to offer virgins before the gods, in order to make that possible, you're thrown off the cliff, or you drive your plane into the enemy warships, just like what the Japanese did during World War II. These are examples of altruistic and egoistic suicides. Those are aberrations. It tells you that there's something wrong with society because people cannot see or differentiate themselves from others. The opposite side of this spectrum is, of course, when society is too weak, that people feel like they don't belong. So, what Durkheim did was to study the suicide rates across different times of the year in a particular place, let's say England. And what he found out was interesting, although not that unexpected. During Christmas, New Year, Valentine's Day, or special occasions when feelings of belongingness are heightened, people who feel like they do not belong kill themselves. That's what you call as egoistic suicide. They feel hurt. Nobody loves me. I'm gonna go tie myself up a tree. No. The other example of this is when society undergoes economic depression, no, everybody else, everybody becomes poor, then you can understand why people kill themselves. But quite interestingly, people also kill themselves when society, uh, you know, succeeds or is an economic prosperity. No, what is the element here that matters? That's indicative of why people kill themselves. In both instances, there's a shift in the norms or mores of society. No, that's why you call these as anomic suicides. No? When there's a shift in the rules of society, no, or in the morals of society, like in the time of war, or in time of economic prosperity, or in time of economic boom, people kill themselves. What do these 2 points by Durkheim and Marx driving at? What are they driving at? They're driving at an idea of society as a structure, as an external force impinging upon the individual. No? This is how society determines our life chances. No? And I'm introducing that as a next concept to discuss also another theorist who's more similar to Marx than Durkheim. No? C. Wright Mills introduced this notion of life chances. That's why the title of that particular subchapter in this essay is about the Lumad astronaut. No, I mean, you compare the life chances of a Lumad who grew up somewhere in Surigao del Sur to become an astronaut, compared to the son of a white Anglo-Saxon male who grew up in California and who had all this access to libraries and stuff, while growing up. Definitely, the white child would have more chances of becoming, because that's the way society is ordered, and our lives are predetermined by the society we're born into. No, in other words, society is an external force, and it impinges upon us as individuals. No, going back to the idea that the self is a modern fiction. If you think that you're free as an individual, think again. The very possibility of freedom was placed there inside your head by society. No? If you think that selling your labor power to the capitalist is an act of freedom, then that's the power of capitalism in fooling you into thinking that that is freedom. If you go kill yourself and think that it is your final act of freedom as an expression of your disgust and loneliness with society, think again. It's not that romantic from the lenses of sociology, because what you're actually doing is using yourself as a casualty of society's shifts and changes, or particular condition at a particular point in time. You're just a symptom of a social aberration if you commit suicide. That's the implication of Durkheim's work. If you're able to push it to its logical conclusion. A theorist was able to uh, make sense of all of this. And once again, like Berger and Luckmann point us to the possibility of freedom, was somebody who wrote our penultimate book, in sociology, something that you probably learned in Sociology 101, C. Wright Mills' Sociological Imagination. What did C. Wright Mills say? And I'm going to read it. No? I just talked to you about the perspectives of Marx and Durkheim when it came to the self. And C. Wright Mills also pointed to that same point, or conclusion, when he argued that people in society have certain life chances, and these life chances are determined by which particular class of society they're born into. That's why he talked about personal issues and social troubles. If you are just psychologically inept and you are lazy, and that's the reason why you can't find work, that's a personal trouble. But C. Wright Mills was more concerned about this whole idea of social issues. But if there are many of you who can't find work, like right now, where 40% of the labor force has been unemployed as a result of the pandemic, it's not your fault anymore, but there's something wrong with the system. He wrote this in the 1950s, post-war, when, quite curiously, America was the leading superpower with the largest economy in the world at that time. But C. Wright Mills was sensitive to the whole idea that even under such conditions, there were still a lot of social demarcations between classes. And he was concerned about how people cannot see this. He called it a social anxiety that people cannot put their finger on. And that imagination that would finally liberate them from this anxiety that they cannot explain is supposedly sociology. And what is this nugget of wisdom that sociologists must be able to offer everyone? No, and I'm quote from his work. No, the first fruit of this imagination. He was talking about the sociological imagination, and the first lesson of the social science that embodies it is that the idea that the individual can understand her own experience and gauge her own faith only by locating herself within her period, that she can know her life chances in life only by becoming aware of all individuals and her circumstances. In many ways, it is a terrible lesson. In many ways, a magnificent one. What is C. Wright Mills driving at? He's saying that we are sociologists. We must be able to also understand the genesis of ideas, the evolution of ideas. And where has capitalism brought us? It has brought us to the point where we see our frustrations in society, our frustrations in life, as a product of our individual intrinsic inadequacies. That's the kind of illusion that capitalism would want us to believe in, to blame ourselves as victims. But what C. Wright Mills is trying to point at is precisely because that's the illusion that capitalism wants us to imbibe. That's why we must resist it. No? The terrible lesson here is that your fate is tied to the fate of your people who belong to the same class. I mean, many of you here will become members of the middle class, if not yet already. No? But the mindset of sociology or capitalism is to teach us with the aspiration to beat one another, uh, to aspire for that one position, but you'd have to step on other people like you. No? The terrible lesson of using this sociological imagination is the realization that they are making us fight with each other for their benefit. What we must realize is that we can only be free if we fight together. Our fates are tied to one another. That's the painful lesson of sociology. At the same time, it is its most magnificent one. The only way that we can be free is when we free other people with us. Okay? Wow, another powerful idea here. No? At first, we were talking about how society is such a suffocating, powerful entity that impinges upon us. But what C. Wright Mills is telling us is that many, in fact, all of us are trapped under this system. The only way to be free is when we resist the very conditions, that shape, determine our unfreedom. Okay, and the only way we can do that is through the practice of the sociological imagination. Okay, wow. The solution to these types of problems require institutional adjustments, if not comprehensive social change. By arming the common folk with this rudimentary yet empowering understanding of how structures impinge on their individual lives, Mills and his brand of emancipatory sociology allow these individuals to begin to think of ways of transforming these institutional arrangements for the good, not just of themselves, but also for the many, if not all. Okay? Powerful shit here from C. Wright Mills. That's why he still remains one of my favorite sociologists. No? We can be free, no, by freeing others with us. But I'm not done yet. No, I'm not done yet. Let me just grab myself a glass of water. Okay, I so far discussed two major parts. No, the first part was Herbert Mead, Berger and Luckmann, uh, how we achieve from fragmented selves to complete selves. After that, we talked about um, Marx and Durkheim, and then Seawright Mills. The third part, the third portion, is a lot more uh, depressing, a lot more. Uh, um, what's the word for it? Suffocating, a lot more suffocating. And going to talk about the perspective of dramaturgical sociology by Irving Goffman. Uh, it's a cynical path that we are treading here now. No? In his work, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, he likens everyday social reality as a stage and all of us as actors in a performance. And he goes on to create a division between the front stage and the backstage. The front stage is our uh, part of ourselves that is attuned to the expectations of others. In society, we're thrown into situations where there's a social script that we must know. You know? And in the furtherance of these roles that we play, we have a lot of masks that we wear. These masks are requirements. You know? And what Durkheim, Durkheim, what Goffman was trying to arrive at is that it's as if in everyday life social setting, we are always compelled. You're always compelled uh, to act according to the script provided by society. Okay? All the world is a stage. Men and women are merely players. If if you were to pursue this line of thought to its logical conclusion, and particularly zeroing in on the issue of the front stage as opposed to the backstage, did Goffman really give space for a backstage to exist? No? Or all of us are front stages and there's really no backstage where the true self resides? All of us are performing before an imaginary uh, actor who's the one inside your head. You're also performing as an individual based upon who you think you are. I've just come across this uh, kind of depressing thought going over Goffman's ideas once again. No? Even in our most solitary moments, who is there but someone who is performing before an imaginary notion of who they think they are? No? There is no backstage. We are all actors. We are also acting in front of ourselves inside our minds. And it can be made more sense of by Goffman's allegory using as a metaphor the onion. What is an onion? But layers and layers of masks. If you peel all these masks, there's no core at the center. What is modern man but a being that's always forced to act before the demands of an audience? No? And that's why, many people like Kaufman because he's able to, break down everyday life into these interesting parts that are, we are capable of understanding everyday life from these elements. But the philosophical implication of such ideas is to argue that There is no core self where agency or freedom emanates. All of who we are is just a mass of societal expectations, some of which we meet, some of which we don't, some of which we suffer for. But if you peel all these expectations and try to look at the core, there's nothing there. Even your resistance is nothing, because that's also a kind of mass that you put on. The ultimate power resides in society, no? And that's why he's often compared to another French thinker, though Goffman was American. They were not contemporaries and probably did not belong to the same school of thought. But in recent times, there have been many sociologists who compare the parallelisms in their work. And this is Michel Foucault. No, he's a considered a post-structuralist thinker. So he goes beyond the idea of structure, no? of uh, of Marx and Durkheim. No, what is Foucault saying? No, his most famous work was The Prison, and what he did was to study the practices inside the prison. One of his most famous idea was a notion of a panopticon, following the architectural work of Jeremy Bentham. Now, do you imagine how a prison looks like then and now? This is a sorry. Imagine this is a top view of a prison. No, the prison usually is built this way. You have cells. This is a top view. You have cells there, a number of cells. You can imagine this to be a three-story building. The center of the prison is a structure, a circular structure, a tower, where you have windows looking out. That structure is called the panopticon. And what do you think is the function of the panopticon? The function of the panopticon is to mess with the see being seen dyad. We've all played hide and seek, diba? Tago-taguan. And what is uh, the rule of hide and seek? The rule of hide and seek is if you see him, he can also see you, right? But that's precisely the kind of relationship that the panopticon messes with. No? All these occupants inside the prison cells will always imagine themselves to be being watched, and in fact, there's just one prison guard inside. No? In other words, the panopticon, the architectural structure, magnifies uh, the power of the prison guard by making them see without being seen. Now, that's the prison, no? But what was Jeremy Bentham talking about? He wasn't talking about the panopticon as purely an architectural, physical entity, but he was actually talking about the panopticon as a societal function that is located not in the physical realm, but in our conscience, in our minds. Are you familiar with the Safeguard commercial about ang aking konsensya? That's precisely where the panopticon is located. It's inside our minds. No? And you put that together with the idea of Goffman about masks. All of us are just a jumbled mess of hysteric masks trying to deal with the problem and demands of the panopticon. And one of the powerful lessons of Durkheim is to use his allegory of the prison as an example of society. There is no outside, there is no escape. No? The prison is an allegory of what takes place inside society at large. No? I mean, he had a very interesting take on the prison. You put people inside prisons because you take away something that's important from them. That's individual freedom. Again, modern fiction. You know? But are people really rehabilitated inside the prison? What happens to this thing that is being taken away? Nothing. You just stay there and then they die. Some of them get out at some point. So the real function of a prison is not to punish those who are within, but actually to serve as a panoptic reminder of what will happen to you if you violate private property, if you kill someone, if you one does not spill soup. I'm reminded of that again. That's what happens to you when you violate the rules of society. Therefore, the prison is a symbolic manifestation of the power of society, and there is no escape. Okay, and this is really a depressing, cynical conclusion. That's one tradition within sociology. No, to consider all of us as trapped, consider all of us as being inside one big prison, and that's why a lot of those who do not offer hope believe in this kind of thing. It's also a sexy idea. I mean, I was taken by this when I first taught sociology, and I, I infected very many young people with depression and sadness, and I apologize for that, no, because I thought it was such a sexy idea to imagine all of this as a suffocating reality, and there's no freedom for individuals to. But then, I go back to the work of Marx. I go back to the work of C. Wright Mills, even Berger and Luckmann. What did they say? There, it's not a dead end. Society is powerful, yes. Yes, we are all actors, and the demands of life can be very suffocating. But that very language to understand the conditions of our existence actually gives us the very power to go beyond it. That's why I go back, no, to the idea of C. Wright Mills. We go back to C. Wright Mills and his hopeful and emancipatory brand of sociology. Society and the self is linked to each other in an inextricable dialectical relationship. No? C. Wright Mill's suggestion is for us to use our sociological imagination in order to understand how social structures determine our life chances, how we are being made as pawns, directed as actors, always wearing masks, with the panopticon inside our heads, determining our actions. The sociological imagination, according to C. Wright Mills, will teach us this painful, terrible lesson, but will also teach us a magnificent one. All of us are not free, and the only way we can be free is when we free ourselves in others. No? That's the power that C. Wright Mills is trying to pass on to us, like Thanos stones, uh, in the sociological imagination. Only by understanding the circumstances of our own unfreedom that we share with others will we be able to begin the magnificent task of transforming society for the freedom not just of our individual selves, but also of one and all. So, no, it's not Foucault for me. No, it's not Goffman for me. But there are important realizations to understand that we cannot wallow in nihilism and cynicism. We have no choice but to hope and be free. And within sociology, where is freedom? No? We don't believe in the constraint, but we will believe in the freedom that Marx, that C. Wright Mills, that Berger and Luckmann offered before us. We have the language for that, and that's the language of sociology. Thank you. Afternoon.